Chapter 9. A traitor is a traitor and always will be, because betrayal is an inherent and abominable evil that far surpasses any kind of horrendous crime. And there is no room for a traitor's repentance, as it only occurs on rare and infrequent occasions, since the exception confirms the rule. And Mason was doubly treacherous, for he carried it in his blood and had inherited it from his ancestors, as he fully demonstrated on that occasion. Upon hearing Dario Cox's voice, intimidating Hugh Paul's personal guard to surrender, fear seized his blackened and corrupted soul, for he knew that the space explorer was tough and unyielding. Moreover, he sensed that Paul's cause was almost lost, and without giving it much thought, he decided to switch sides. He was in the hall of the red building that served as the Central Army's laboratory and had just returned from the Valther II, locked in the nearby enormous hangar, where over 100 physicists were in vain trying to get the robots paralyzed by Sonda to function. The soldiers and officers of the general staff were running around Mason in all directions, disoriented, and the old villain thought that alongside Cox he might preserve his life. Thus he took cover behind a metallic column, and as soon as he saw Tyrrell appear, transformed into a furious Achilles, he called out, "Hey, Mr. Tyrrell. Come here. I'm Mason, and I want to do you a favor. I'm repentant, and there's still time to amend the mistakes I've made." Basil was about to kill him, surprised and disgusted, as his finger tightened on the rifle's trigger. But he thought that perhaps Mason could be useful to them. So he approached him, first ensuring that the old man wasn't wielding any weapon. "Damn old man," roared Basil. "I don't know why I don't kill you right here. Where's Paul?" "Upstairs, in the laboratory. But he won't be able to get up there. There are over 100 general staff officers guarding him. Come with me, maybe we can get the blue rocket operational. If Sonda helps us, we can blow up the hangar and climb up to the laboratory's rooftop. We know that Dario has returned from Vesta with Sonda, and she is omnipotent. Where is she?" "I don't know, Mason." "And Cox?" "I heard him scream." "I don't know either. Maybe he fell back there." And turning toward the door, shaken by a sudden unease, he shouted to Bobby Green, who was firing behind one of the columns, "Bobby, come here. Where is Dario?" Bobby didn't know either. But they couldn't waste time. And at that moment, Basil felt dizzy. Immediately after, Sonda's voice echoed in his mind. "Tyrrell, follow Mason and recover the Valther II. You'll need it soon." He followed Green and Mason, who led them down a corridor, through which they could see the sky streaked with thousands of spotlights searching the night for the mysterious attacking rocket. Groups of soldiers armed to the teeth were running through the bushes and along the avenues in all directions, and orders were coming out contradictory from everywhere. Upon reaching a bend in the corridor, they encountered several soldiers stationed next to a staircase, identical to the one in the other sector of the building where Dario Cox was ascending at that moment. But Mason gave them a quick gesture, and they dropped their weapons upon recognizing him. Only upon seeing the two explorers did they suspect something, but Basil and Bobby didn't let them recover from their astonishment. Pressing their lips together, the two fired simultaneously in a spread and took them all down. "My God," murmured Mason, paling. For a moment, he had thought Tyrrell would shoot him too, and felt the most abject terror tickling his spinal marrow. And he added, stammering, through here. "Follow me." He headed towards the door, connecting to the outer ramp. His stammering ceased immediately as Bobby grabbed his arm, saying, "Don't play tricks on us, old man, or you'll regret it." No, I swear. Trust me." And they all ran, following the ramp and a metallic path that wound through bushes and patches of green grass, guiding them to the door of the large elongated building, before which a group of men dressed in civilian clothes were struggling to escape, but several armed sentinels were preventing them. "What's happening, Mason?" asked an officer pushing the civilian men into the hangar. "I don't know, Captain Harrow. There's a big commotion, and no one understands anyone." Mason turned to Tyrrell and Green and said, "Come this way, gentlemen." "Hey, who are these guys?" now asked the officer. "They are from President Paul's espionage service," quickly replied Mason. All right, let them through if they want. But I warn you that no one will leave here except you, Mason, until I can contact the President's Guard commander. Back, damn it. And saying this, Harrow lunged at the scientists struggling to exit the hangar, forcibly restraining the guard. Tyrrell and Green followed Mason, who made his way through elbows into the interior of the hangar, and then they could see the Valther II, perched on an endless row of railway platforms. They ran along its enormous elongated fuselage to the place where scaffolding led to the metal ladder of the open gate. And they didn't take long to find themselves inside the extragalactic vehicle. Tyrrell and Green saw the robots, clad in their blue overalls, motionless in the corridors, as if death had suddenly fallen upon all of them. Mason knew they had been like this since they returned from Vesta, and there was still no clue as to what hidden and mysterious force kept them so static. Many of them had been stripped of their sleeves and dismantled by Paul's scientists, but nothing and no one had been able to get them moving. But Mason, Karen, Vasiev, and Professor Schwartz were unaware that thanks to the robots, they had been able to return to Earth carrying Tyrrell, O'Brien, and Green as prisoners. Sonda had spared their lives and immobilized their servants once the journey was complete for simple sentimental reasons. And the most astonishing part was that no sooner had the three men, Mason, Tyrrell, and O'Brien, entered the ship than, to their great surprise, several robots began to move and stand up, as if waking from a long sleep. Mason fell to his knees upon seeing this, trembling like a frantic man, because in that sudden movement of the robots he saw the mysterious hand of a righteous vengeance. "Sonda, forgive me," he whimpered. "Stand up, miserable," Tyrrell shouted, pushing him with the barrel of his rifle. But Mason, trembling, didn't get up. And then something truly eerie happened, without Basil or Bobby having time to prevent it. One of the robots began to move and approached them with mechanical gestures. Mason saw it approaching and clutched his hands in a pleading gesture. "No, I don't want to die. Forgive me, Sonda, forgive me." But it was useless to crawl, because the robot, obeying an inflexible order coming from the flying saucer somewhere in the sky, raised its hand over the traitor's gray head. And suddenly, it let it fall with a violent blow. Mason's skull split open like a grenade, and particles of his brain splattered onto the clothes of the two men, who turned their faces away to avoid witnessing that horrible yet just death. "Thus end the traitors," Tyrrell said in a hoarse voice. Then, inside the spaceship, a feverish activity ensued. The robots directed the two young men towards the flight control room. Meanwhile, the masked metallic figures took their positions to start the enormous space rocket. In less than 3 minutes, precisely at the instant Dario Cox threw his last grenade into the laboratory's meeting room, the enormous blue spindle began to move within the hangar. The television screens inside the flight control room showed Tyrrell and Bobby the indescribable confusion that prompted the Valther II to move among the scientists and guards crowding at the hangar entrance. At that very moment, Tyrrell received telepathic instructions from Sonda. But he noticed they were arriving very weakly to his brain, like coming from a tired voice. "Come to Dario's aid, Tyrrell. I sense he's in grave trouble. Prepare the black box at the back, under the testing clocks. Turn just to right and press the triggers. Gravitational grenades will paralyze all mechanical movement from the ground up to above the building. Come on, act quickly." Other screens showed Green the accelerated movement of the robots preparing to execute the orders they received from their mistress and lady. At that precise moment, the Valther II began a slow upward and forward march breaking through the hangar's roof. The scientists and Captain Harrow's guards fled terrified, tripping and throwing their weapons. At the same time, from the open combat slots emerged the black metallic snouts of the anti-gravitational cannons. And when Tyrrell, following Sonda's instructions, pressed the black box's controls, the grenades didn't take long to launch and explode in the air around the red building. At the same instant, over 500 reaction spacecraft swooped down on the mouth of the Lupata River, intensely bombarding all military installations in Killimane, especially the vast concentration of amphibious rockets that, like a metallic swarm, settled on the restless waters of Mozambique's coastline. The sky turned into a flaming hell, the earth burned, and the atomic explosions rumbled, destroying everything and cutting down thousands of lives at once. Later, more Iridium Hawks from General Sutton's squadrons arrived, and others in fantastic waves, which only left the sector marked by the laboratory's red building free. Bobby Green and Basil Tyrrell received orders from Sonda to position the Valther II at the upper rear part of the building occupied by the laboratory. And as soon as the blue spindle exited the hangar, it positioned itself over the building, aiming the bow towards the meeting room's windows where Paul and the two generals were. And both Tyrrell and Green, upon seeing the scene taking place inside, opened their eyes at the television screen, speechless with panic. Because the atomic pistols wielded by Hugh Paul's two generals were now firing at the figures of Karen and Dario, who were embracing at the entrance door. Many brains were paralyzed by the impression of witnessing that decisive moment. And Dario Cox, the most concerned, had instinctively closed his eyes. Karen, unaware of what was about to happen, had fainted in Dario's arms, and Franz Schwarz believed that the last moment had arrived for his female colleague and the famous explorer. Hugh Paul and his two collaborators believed it too. Franz Schwarz, however, hoisted a chair over his head to throw it at his oppressors. And Sonda, up there, over 12,000 meters high, alongside the nervous Mark O'Brien, who was smoking and smoking, blowing large puffs of smoke that filled the cabin, his hands tense on the flight controls, sent a quick telepathic message, accelerating the anti-gravity action. Both Basil Tyrrell, Bobby Green, and the rebellious generals witnessed something so astonishing that it left them speechless for quite a while. For the latter, forever. Everyone saw the deadly flash from the pistols. And they also saw that the fatal atomic charge stopped in midair, inches behind Karen Vasiev's back, who remained inert in Dario Cox's arms, resigned to die. Even the chair Franz Schwarz was throwing at that moment remained suspended, suddenly, in the air. Dario Cox was the first to react. He opened his eyes, understood immediately, and pushed Karen aside. He fired his pistol, but the deadly ray didn't fire either. Paul let out a high-pitched scream, like a scared rat, for he was actually a complete coward, and turned around to take refuge in the laboratory, where a large electrical battery was flashing, unaffected by the anti-gravity, whose phenomena were unknown to all. One of the generals, quite young, as expected in a revolutionary army, tried to confront Dario's aggression. But as soon as they came into contact, he was flipped upside down awkwardly. Then the enraged Dario delivered a powerful right hook to the general, sending him flying backward against the window. At that moment, Franz Schwarz, despite his age, and seeing the turn events were taking, remembered the insults and abuses he had received from Paul and his people, and launched himself after the traitor, grabbing him by the coat before he could pass through a small door. The Australian man thrashed, and they both rolled on the ground. When Dario left the general out of combat, he realized something surprising. The sharp, metallic bow of the space rocket had aimed at the window, and was advancing slowly but inexorably. The floor of the room opened up, and all the devices occupying the space trembled, as if shaken by a cyclone. Dario searched for Paul, and saw him stand up and turn his face, terrified. Schwarz lay motionless on the ground. And Dario observed such horror on the miserable assassin's face that he was about to laugh. The ex-Australian agent, traitor to Sonda and traitor to humanity, even a traitor to himself, backed away. And walking backward, he approached the large high-voltage arc. He brought his hands to his face, as if not to see Dario's hypnotic gaze, and took another step back. Dario didn't have time to prevent his death, for as he tried to hold him, the wall continued to collapse, and his first thought was of the unconscious Karen. Therefore, while holding her in his arms, he couldn't witness the horrifying death of the great traitor, as Dario had aptly called him earlier. Paul, while backing away, crashed into the enormous high-voltage arc. Hugh Paul's body disappeared in a blinding flash, and myriad sparks were expelled in all directions, remaining suspended and extinguished after a few seconds. Then there was a dull explosion, barely audible, given the indescribable clamor of the terrifying external bombardment. That malevolent subject's life was definitively cut short, dying with his excessive ambition to have wanted to grasp the reins of all the system's governments, which had enjoyed a period of peace and tranquility for years, beyond what any prophet could have dreamed. Franz Schwarz, from the ground, watched Paul die and felt such exhaustion in his body that if Dario hadn't helped him, he wouldn't have been able to get up. And half an hour later, aboard the Valther II, the battered German professor couldn't recover. As the wall collapsed, Dario had received quick instructions from Sonda. "Inside my ship are your friends, coming to rescue you. Jump onto the deck, through the rubble of the ruined laboratory, and board the Valther II. Hurry, for the love of God, Dario. I can't take it anymore. I'm going to die soon." Cox was paralyzed by the fear that Sonda might die. Then he remembered her metallic leg cover. "Let's go quickly, Professor," he shouted. But unconsciously, the German had leaned down to pick up his Thomason, which had fallen to the ground from the table where Paul had left it shortly before, and followed Dario. Tyrrell, in turn, had opened the hatch, as per Sonda's order, and laid out a metal ladder to the ruined building. And Dario, Karen, and the professor were able to board. How did they manage to do it? Even Dario himself couldn't explain, as he found himself walking on the void, like on that other occasion when he exited the Delta V. Beneath, illuminated by fires, he saw groups of soldiers fleeing frantically in all directions. The cracked floor of the laboratory and the void between the wall and the ship seemed the same under Dario Cox's feet. They were the same ones again, making the singular walk. Him, Karen, and Schwartz, the latter walking like an automaton. Finally, they entered the ship, and the hatches were closed. Dario saw Basil Tyrrell and Bobby Green running towards them with outstretched arms. He closed his eyes, released the tension so long concentrated for the fight, and as he fell collapsed to the ground, his last thought was of the strange and beautiful woman who had done so much good for all the Earthlings. "Thank you, Sonda. Thank you for everything." And from the remote space, a call echoed in his now dormant mind. "Come to my side, Dario, come soon. I'm dying." Q. Paul's great army was completely destroyed, without the attackers suffering excessive casualties. Killimane was razed within a 50-kilometer radius, and with this colossal aerial battle, in which the adversary could barely offer resistance, the brief period of the rebel president's government ended. General Sutton landed in Madagascar and established his headquarters in the city of Tananarive. At first light, Major Hercule and his entire Martian fleet joined him after executing the famous Hercule Sweep, which would go down in history by that name. From there, messages were broadcast worldwide explaining the great triumph and urging the new authorities to surrender without a fight, reinstating the former presidents and governors to their posts. In a single day, the one preceding the fateful night of Killimane, rebels from all over the world were arrested and taken to prison to be tried for rebellion, although the main responsible parties had already perished. As for Dario Cox and his companions, they didn't appear until 3 days later, when Sutton already considered them dead in the fantastic bombardment. It was in the afternoon when the Valther II slowly descended from the sky, carrying the small flying saucer alongside it, in which the lifeless body of Sonda lay in Dario Cox's arms. Upon landing the gigantic rocket in Tananarive, Dario's companions, Karen and Schwartz, emerged from the main hatch. A little later, Dario stepped out of the saucer holding the rigid body of the beautiful Sonda. She had died. But Dario had arrived in time to receive her last message. Mark O'Brien had told him, as soon as he arrived at the saucer, "It's contaminated with radioactivity. We're dying hopelessly, Dario." "Sonda, my dear Sonda," murmured Dario, kneeling beside her. The hand of the woman from Zokla closed over his. "Thank God you arrived in time, Dario. I want you by my side in this trance. I know that everything has turned out well. We'll take you quickly to Earth and heal you. No, there's no time. I'm going to die now, soon. Tell me, Dario, do you love me a little?" "With all my soul, Sonda." "Thank you, Dario. Thank you very much." Sonda half closed her eyes and looked at the man's face. She shuddered. "I didn't want to tell you anything. It was while I was building this device. You threw me to the ground, and a carbon crystal tore my leg. I was angry with you, but I have forgiven you, my love. Radioactivity penetrated the wound. Vesta is a radioactive danger, although my ivory coating would have resisted. I love you, Dario. I love you with all my soul. I wish that when I die, my servants will guide the ship to Antares. My husband will come with me in his coffin. I want to lie eternally on my ground. There, with my people. Sonda's agony lasted exactly 2 more days. After this period, whispering tender words to Dario, the two of them alone inside the small saucer, and not wanting to heed the pleas coming from the Valther II, made by his companions, remained until Sonda's life faded away like a breath. The last thing she said was, "House te with Ka-Rin. She loves you." Then, her ivory hand became limp between Dario's strong ones. For this reason, when Cox appeared on Earth with his mournful cargo, he resembled more a specter than a human being. Yet, his passage across the runway, among the flying devices of the Space Army honoring him, was something emotive, sublime. Karen Vasiev was crying nearby, leaning on Franz Schwartz's shoulder. And the next day, in a simple ceremony that Dario did not attend, distressed as he was, Sonda was placed in her lead coffin and carried on the shoulders of her robots, who had received prior instructions, towards the blue spaceship. General Sutton had his own medals welded to the Valther II helmet, and shortly after, the enormous blue missile slowly ascended into the sky, carrying Sonda's body, that strange woman to whom all of humanity owed their freedom. As for Dario Cox, after remaining in a complete state of devastation for several days, he decided to secretly depart for Brazil. But it wasn't just that. When he sat in his Delta V seat, he felt arms wrap around his neck and 2 hands place a cigarette in his mouth and offer him a lighter. Karen Vasiev was behind him for the second time, and now alone. "I'll go with you until death. And I won't leave you even if you kill me," she said passionately. "Thank you, Karen. I need you so much." As for Franz Schwartz, things went differently for him. He, along with Tyrrell, O'Brien, and Bobby Green, were the ones who incriminated Sutton and the president of the UN organization. And when interrogated by the newly liberated high dignitaries about his studies on anti-gravity, he simply said, respecting Sonda's wishes, nothing was touched on the Valther II, and everything left with her for Antares. However, the anti-graviton has not been lost for Earth's peaceful and scientific purposes. Thomason worked well and gladly. A photoelectric microcell has recorded the functioning and reaction of antigravitons, which have become part of my curious collection of internuclear particles. "Are you saying you can reproduce an antigravitational reaction?" asked, surprised, General Clark Sutton. "Yes, sir, I can. And I will." "So when Hugh Paul interrogated you, you knew all this, didn't you? Why didn't you speak up?" "I knew and didn't speak up because I wanted to demonstrate to some of my recent friends that without knowing jiu-jitsu and being Quixotes like the Himalayas, one can still be a man. Moreover, Miss Karen was in front, and I could leave her in a bad place. Because she didn't speak either, and I'm convinced she knows as much about anti-gravity as I do. To her and Dario Cox, I wish you much happiness in the future." "Me too," responded Sutton with a slight tremor in his voice. "And us," added Basil Tyrrell, Mark O'Brien, and Bobby Green. They had even gotten used to speaking in unison. The end.